every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There are moments captured on film that are not merely recordings of an event, but historical fault lines. They are brief, flickering images that expose a chasm in our society, a divide between what we profess to believe and what the camera proves to be true. Before the ubiquity of the smartphone, before viral videos became a daily occurrence, there was a tape, 81 seconds of grainy, chaotic, and profoundly disturbing footage, shot from a balcony in the San Fernando Valley. It was a window into a darkness that many suspected, but few had ever witnessed with such undeniable clarity. The date was March 3, 1991. The time was just after midnight. The sound is a symphony of urban dread, the distant wail of sirens growing closer, the frantic shouting of men, and a sound that is both sickeningly wet and brutally sharp, the percussive thud of aluminum batons striking flesh and bone. The image is of a man, a large black man, on the ground, surrounded by a swarm of blue-uniformed police officers. He tries to rise, and for his effort, he is met with a furious volley of kicks and baton strikes. The scene is illuminated by the cold, sterile beams of headlights and flashlights, turning the asphalt into a brutal stage. This was the world's introduction to Rodney Glenn King, and for millions, it was an irrefutable indictment of the Los Angeles Police Department. The video seemed to tell the entire story, a simple and horrific narrative of unchecked police brutality. It was seen as the perfect case, the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream of. An unimpeachable witness that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't forget details, couldn't be accused of bias. The camera simply saw what it saw. The public saw it too, and in their collective outrage, they believed justice was a foregone conclusion. They were wrong. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a verdict. We will explore the intricate and, to many, infuriating journey of those 81 seconds of tape from a private citizen's camera into the American legal system. We will analyze how this seemingly irrefutable evidence of a crime was systematically dismantled, reframed, and ultimately rejected by a jury. This is the story of the legal alchemy that transformed a brutal beating into a justifiable application of police procedure, and how that transformation pushed a city past its breaking point, igniting a firestorm of rage, destruction, and death. This is the story of how a verdict became the spark. The night began, as these nights often do, with a traffic violation. Just past 12:30 a.m. on Sunday, March 3, 1991, California Highway Patrol Officer Melanie Singer was parked with her husband and partner, Tim Singer, when a white 1987 Hyundai Excel sped past them on the 210 freeway in the San Fernando Valley. They clocked the car at a high rate of speed, some reports suggesting it was going as fast as 117 miles per hour. Though this figure would later be disputed. The officers took pursuit, initiating a chase that would wind through residential streets for nearly 8 miles. Inside the Hyundai was 25-year-old Rodney King, along with his two friends, Bryant Allen and Freddie Helms. King was at the wheel, and he was terrified. He had been drinking, and he was on parole for a robbery conviction from 1987. A DUI, especially one involving a high-speed chase, would be a parole violation. For King, the prospect of returning to prison was a specter more frightening than the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. So he didn't stop. He drove on, hoping, perhaps, to lose the police cruiser tailing him. But he didn't lose them. The chase drew more units, including a police helicopter and several cars from the Los Angeles Police Department. Finally, King's car was cornered at the intersection of Foothill Boulevard and Osborne Street, right outside the Hanson Dam Recreation Area in Lakeview Terrace. The area was dark, residential, and about to become the setting for an event that would change the course of American history. When the car stopped, the CHP officers were quickly superseded by the arriving LAPD units. The scene commander was Sergeant Stacy Kuhn of the LAPD Foothill Division. King's two passengers, Allen and Helms, exited the vehicle and complied with police commands. They were taken into custody without incident. They would later describe the scene as chaotic and filled with aggressive shouting from the dozen or so officers present. But King did not immediately comply. He remained in the car, and when he finally emerged, his behavior was, by all accounts from the officers on the scene, bizarre and erratic. They would later testify that he was giggling, waving at the police helicopter overhead, and even patting the ground. He seemed to be ignoring their commands to lie flat on the ground. The officers would frame this behavior as menacing and noncompliant. They suspected he was on PCP, a drug known to induce bizarre behavior and extraordinary strength. A later toxicology report would show King's blood alcohol content was 0.19, more than double the legal limit at the time, but found no traces of PCP. The officers on the scene, however, didn't have that information. They saw a large, 225-pound man who was not following orders, a man they perceived as an immediate and unpredictable threat. Sergeant Kuhn, a training officer with a reputation for being by the book, took charge. He ordered 4 of his officers, Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wind, Theodore Briceño, and Rolando Solano, to move in and subdue King using a technique known as a swarm, where multiple officers grab a suspect's limbs to control them. But the swarm failed. King, according to the officers, threw them off his back with surprising strength. It was at this moment that Kuhn made a decision to escalate the use of force. He drew his taser and fired, striking King in the back. King screamed and fell to his knees. But then, to the shock of the officers, he rose again. Kuhn fired the second and final cartridge from the taser. King went down again, but once more, he struggled back to his feet. For Sergeant Kuhn and the officers under his command, this was a critical turning point. The suspect had resisted a swarm and had now shaken off 2 taser shots. In the rigid procedural mindset of LAPD use of force policy, this meant escalating to the next level, impact weapons. Kuhn gave the order to use their metal PR-24 side-handle batons. He directed his officers to use what were called power strokes, aiming for major joints like the elbows, wrists, knees, and ankles to cause pain and force compliance, while avoiding strikes to the head, neck, and spine, which were considered deadly force. It was precisely at this moment, as officers Powell and Wind began to strike the stumbling Rodney King, that a man named George Holliday was awakened by the commotion outside his apartment building. A plumber by trade and an amateur video enthusiast, Holliday had recently purchased a new Sony Video 8 Handycam. He grabbed his camera, walked out onto his balcony, and pressed record. For the next 81 seconds, George Holliday's lens captured the unfolding brutality. The tape is relentless. It shows King on the ground, attempting to rise or crawl away, only to be met with a furious barrage of baton strikes from Powell and Wind. At one point, Officer Briceño is seen stepping on King's neck or upper back, an action his lawyer would later argue was an attempt to keep King down and stop the beating. The officers can be heard yelling commands like, "Get down," and "Stay down," while King is on the ground, absorbing dozens of blows. Sergeant Kuhn is visible in the background, directing the assault, taser in hand. The beating continues, a chaotic dance of uniformed figures and a lone man on the ground, until King is finally still, hogtied with cuffs and cord. The officers, believing the situation is under control, are unaware that their actions have just been permanently etched into the magnetic tape of George Holliday's camera. In the immediate aftermath, Rodney King was taken to Pacifica Hospital. His injuries were severe: a fractured eye socket, a broken cheekbone, a broken ankle, multiple skull fractures, missing teeth, and numerous bruises and lacerations across his entire body. He would require significant surgery and have permanent damage, including some brain damage and nerve damage to his face. The official police report filed that night told a very different story. It claimed King had sustained only minor cuts and bruises. The report, co-written by Officers Powell and Wind, portrayed King as the aggressor who had violently resisted arrest, forcing them to respond with what they described as a firm but managed application of force. There was no mention of the 56 baton strikes and multiple kicks that doctors would later document. It was a narrative of self-preservation, an official account designed to justify their actions and close the book on a routine arrest of a noncompliant suspect. This sanitized version of events might have been the only one the world ever heard, if not for George Holliday. The next day, shaken by what he had filmed, Holliday contacted the LAPD's Foothill Division to report what he had seen. He was met with indifference. Unsure of what to do, he then called KTLA, a local Los Angeles news station. He brought them the tape. The news director, upon viewing the footage, immediately understood its power. On the evening of March 4, 1991, KTLA broadcast the 81 seconds of tape. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The video was picked up by national news outlets, and within 24 hours, the brutal beating of Rodney King was being played on television screens in living rooms across America and around the world. The raw, unedited violence of the footage was shocking. It directly contradicted the initial police reports and shattered the image of professional law enforcement that the LAPD, under its controversial and hardline chief Daryl Gates, had long cultivated. Public outrage was swift and overwhelming. Protests erupted in Los Angeles. Civil rights leaders, community activists, and ordinary citizens demanded action. Mayor Tom Bradley, a former police officer and the city's first African-American mayor, called the beating sickening and demanded an investigation. Chief Gates, however, initially defended his officers, stating they had acted appropriately. He made a series of public gaffes, including the infamous suggestion that black people might have different physiologies that made them more susceptible to chokeholds, further inflaming public anger and cementing his reputation as being dangerously out of touch with the city's minority communities. The political pressure became unbearable. The footage was simply too powerful to ignore or explain away. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office launched an investigation, and on March 14th, just 11 days after the incident, the Los Angeles County Grand Jury returned indictments against 4 of the officers involved. Sergeant Stacy Kuhn, Officer Lawrence Powell, and Officer Timothy Wind were charged with assault with a deadly weapon and use of excessive force. Officer Theodore Briceño was charged with excessive force. A 5th officer who was present was granted immunity for his testimony. The stage was now set for one of the most consequential criminal trials in modern American history. The public, having seen the video, believed the outcome was certain. Justice, it seemed, was finally at hand. As the case against the 4 LAPD officers moved towards trial, their defense attorneys faced a monumental challenge. Their clients had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, condemned by a piece of evidence so visceral that it seemed to preclude any possibility of innocence. The video was the prosecution's entire case, and the defense knew they could not win if the trial were held in the heated, angry, and racially charged atmosphere of Los Angeles County. Their only hope was to move the trial somewhere else. They filed a change of venue motion, arguing that the incessant, overwhelmingly negative media coverage made it impossible to find an impartial jury in Los Angeles. They argued that the political pressure from the mayor's office and the widespread public condemnation of the officers had poisoned the entire jury pool. The argument was persuasive. In a decision that would prove to be perhaps the most critical turning point in the entire saga, the California Court of Appeal granted the motion. The trial of the 4 LAPD officers accused of beating Rodney King would be moved from the diverse, multicultural metropolis of Los Angeles to the small, conservative suburban enclave of Simi Valley in neighboring Ventura County. The demographic shift was staggering, and its importance cannot be overstated. At the time, Los Angeles County was a melting pot of ethnicities, with a large population of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. Simi Valley, by contrast, was a predominantly white middle-class community. It was a city known as a haven for law enforcement officers and their families, a place where the police were generally viewed with respect and trust, not suspicion. It was the home of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, a bastion of conservative California. Moving the trial from the jurisdiction where the crime occurred to Simi Valley fundamentally altered the lens through which the evidence would be viewed. The jury selection process confirmed the defense's strategic victory. The final jury impaneled to hear the case consisted of 10 white jurors, 1 Latina juror, and 1 Asian American juror. There were no African Americans on the jury, the very community that felt most targeted by the kind of police brutality depicted on the holiday tape would have no voice in the jury room. The fate of the 4 white officers would be decided by a jury of their peers. But those peers bore little resemblance to the diverse population of the city they policed. The trial began on March 5, 1992, almost a year to the day after the beating. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Terry White, felt they had an airtight case. Their strategy was simple and direct: play the tape. They believed that the 81 seconds of footage were so self-evidently brutal that no reasonable person could watch it and conclude that the office's actions were justified. They played the video for the jury again and again, at regular speed, letting the raw violence of the scene sink in. They called witnesses, including CHP officer Melanie Singer, who testified that she felt the beating was excessive and that she had tried to intervene, only to be told by Sergeant Kuhn that the LAPD was handling the situation. The prosecution's star witness, however, should have been Rodney King himself. But when King took the stand, his testimony was largely ineffective. He appeared confused, his memory of the night was hazy, and his answers were often monosyllabic. On cross-examination, the defense relentlessly attacked his credibility, bringing up his prior robbery conviction and painting him as an incooperative, intoxicated ex-convict who had brought the violence upon himself by failing to comply with lawful orders. His testimony did little to help the prosecution's cause. The defense, meanwhile, executed a brilliant and methodical strategy. They did not deny that their clients were the men on the tape, or that they had struck Rodney King. Instead, they set out to change what the jury was seeing. They reframed the narrative, transforming the 81 seconds of footage from a brutal assault into a textbook example of professional police work under extreme duress. Their first and most effective tactic was to deconstruct the video. They slowed it down, froze it frame by frame, and provided an alternate narration for every single movement. They argued that the video did not show the beginning of the confrontation. The jury, they claimed, did not see King's erratic behavior, his resistance to the initial swarm, or the way he allegedly rose up after being tased twice. The defense argued that the beating only began after King had demonstrated that he was a dangerous and unpredictable threat. With the help of their own use-of-force expert, a retired LAPD sergeant named Charles Duke, the defense attorneys walked the jury through the tape, one frame at a time. Each baton strike, they argued, was not a random act of violence, but a calculated response to a specific action by King. When King moved a hand, they argued he was reaching for a weapon. When he tried to rise, they claimed he was attempting to charge Officer Powell. They transformed Rodney King from a man writhing in pain on the ground into a hulking, superhuman aggressor who was actively resisting and fighting throughout the entire ordeal. They played on the jury's fears, suggesting King was under the influence of PCP, which they called a dusting, that made him impervious to pain and gave him monstrous strength. The officers themselves took the stand and delivered compelling testimony. They spoke in calm, professional tones, using the jargon of law enforcement to describe their actions. Sergeant Stacy Kuhn was particularly effective. He presented himself not as a brutal commander, but as a cautious manager of a dangerous situation. He testified that he believed King was a threat to his office's lives, and that every action he took was in accordance with his training and LAPD policy. He stated, "I was in total control of my officers. They were in control of the situation. It was not out of control." He convinced the jury that the violence they saw on the tape, however ugly, was necessary and justified. Officer Lawrence Powell, who delivered the majority of the baton blows, testified that he was terrified. He said, "He was growling. I was completely in fear for my life. I was scared to death." He described King as having the look of disregard and of no pain. This narrative, the narrative of the terrified officer facing a monstrous, unpredictable suspect, resonated deeply with the Simi Valley jury. Theodore Briceño's defense took a slightly different path. His attorney sought to distance him from the others, arguing that Briceño actually tried to stop the beating. He pointed to the moment on the tape where Briceño stomps on King's back and argued it was an attempt to pin King to the ground to prevent Powell from striking him again. This created a fissure in the unified front of the officers, but it also reinforced the idea that Powell's actions at least were excessive, even to a fellow officer on the scene. Ultimately, the defense's strategy was a masterclass in legal persuasion. They took the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence, the videotape, and turned it into their own. They slowed it down, re-narrated it, and filtered it through the lens of police procedure and the office's stated fears. They successfully shifted the jury's focus from the undeniable violence of the beating to the alleged provocations and noncompliance of Rodney King. They convinced the jury that what they were seeing was not a crime, but a difficult, dangerous, and professionally executed arrest. The prosecution had asked the jury to believe their own eyes. The defense asked them to believe the office's interpretation of what their eyes were seeing. In the sterile, air-conditioned courtroom in Simi Valley, the defense's interpretation won. After 7 days of deliberations, the jury reached its verdict. On April 29, 1992, the court clerk read the decision. For Sergeant Stacy Kuhn, not guilty on all counts. For Officer Timothy Wind, not guilty on all counts. For Officer Theodore Briceño, not guilty on all counts. For Officer Lawrence Powell, who had delivered the most blows and had sent controversial computer messages after the beating, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts, except for one charge of assault on which they were deadlocked. For all intents and purposes, it was a clean sweep, a total acquittal. In the courtroom, there was a stunned silence, followed by sighs of relief from the defense table. Outside the courthouse and across the city of Los Angeles, the reaction was one of profound shock, disbelief, and a deep simmering anger that was about to erupt. The legal system had processed the 81 seconds of tape and delivered its judgment, and that judgment was about to be answered not with legal briefs or appeals, but with fire. The news of the acquittals spread through Los Angeles like a shockwave. For many, especially in the city's black communities, the verdict was not just a legal decision. It was a profound betrayal. It was a declaration that the undeniable evidence of their eyes meant nothing in a court of law. It confirmed their deepest fears and most cynical beliefs about the American justice system. That there was one set of rules for the police and another for everyone else, particularly people of color. The verdict was the final, definitive insult after decades of harassment, brutality, and systemic neglect at the hands of the LAPD. At City Hall, Mayor Tom Bradley took to the podium, his face a mask of grim disappointment. He tried to project calm, but his words were a stark repudiation of the jury's decision. Today, the jury returned its verdict, he said, but the jury's verdict will not blind us to what we saw on that videotape. The men who beat Rodney King do not deserve to wear the uniform of the LAPD. His statement captured the feeling of millions. The verdict was a legal fiction that could not erase the reality of the video. But in the streets of South Central Los Angeles, words were no longer enough. The accumulated anger, frustration, and pain needed a release. The flashpoint, the place where the fire would first ignite, was a sprawling, busy intersection at the corner of Florence and Normandy Avenues. Within an hour of the verdict being announced, crowds began to gather. The mood was tense, then angry, then violent. People began throwing rocks and bottles at passing cars. The initial targets were symbols of authority, but the violence quickly spiraled, becoming random and indiscriminate. And then came the moment that, like the King beating itself, was captured on camera and broadcast to a horrified nation. A news helicopter hovered overhead, filming as a large gravel truck, driven by a white man named Reginald Denny, entered the intersection. The truck was forced to stop. Denny was dragged from his cab by a group of young black men. He was brutally beaten, kicked in the head and smashed with a brick and a fire extinguisher. He was left unconscious and bleeding in the street. The scene was sickeningly reminiscent of the mob violence of a bygone era, a raw and brutal act of retaliatory rage. The police were nowhere to be seen. In a decision that remains controversial to this day, the LAPD command made the fateful choice to retreat. Police units at Florence and Normandy were ordered to pull back and regroup, creating a lawless vacuum at the epicenter of the growing unrest. The message this sent to the community was clear. The police were abandoning them. For those bent on destruction, it was a green light. For the law-abiding residents and business owners trapped in the area, it was a terrifying realization that they were on their own. The violence that began at Florence and Normandy did not stay there. It exploded outwards, engulfing huge swaths of Los Angeles. This was not simply a riot, it was a multifaceted urban uprising. It was characterized by looting on a massive scale, as people smashed windows and emptied stores of everything from electronics to groceries. It was characterized by arson, as hundreds of buildings were set ablaze, their black smoke creating a funeral shroud over the city skyline that was visible for miles. The sound of the city became a terrifying cacophony of sirens, breaking glass, gunfire, and helicopters. This was not simply a black riot, as it was often portrayed. The crowds of looters were multiracial, reflecting the complex demographics of the affected neighborhoods. And the conflict was not just between black residents and white authority. It had other, older and more complex ethnic dimensions. One of the areas hit hardest was Koreatown. Tensions between the black and Korean American communities had been dangerously high for years, exacerbated by cultural misunderstandings and economic friction. A pivotal event had occurred just 1 year earlier, in March 1991, only 13 days after the King beating. A 15-year-old black girl named Latasha Harlins was shot in the back of the head and killed by a Korean-American convenience store owner, Soon Ya-do, during a dispute over a $1.79 bottle of orange juice. Do was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, but the judge sentenced her to only 5 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. The sentence sparked outrage in the black community, seen as another example of the justice system devaluing black lives. During the 1992 riots, that anger was unleashed upon Korean-owned businesses. Store owners, feeling abandoned by the police, armed themselves with rifles and handguns, taking to their rooftops to defend their property in surreal, televised firefights. For 6 days, Los Angeles burned. The chaos overwhelmed the LAPD. The city was placed under a dusk-to-dawn curfew. The California Army National Guard was deployed, followed by federal troops from the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. It took nearly 20,000 armed soldiers and law enforcement officers to finally restore order to the streets. When the smoke cleared, the scale of the destruction was breathtaking. The official statistics tell a grim story. 63 people were dead, more than 2,300 were injured, and over 12,000 people were arrested. The property damage was estimated at over $1 billion, with more than 3,600 fires set and over 1,100 buildings destroyed. It was the deadliest and most destructive urban uprising in American history since the New York City draft riots of 1863. It laid bare the deep, unhealed wounds of a city fractured by race, poverty, and a profound mistrust of the law. The verdict in the Rodney King case had not created these conditions, but it had been the catalyst, the spark that ignited a powder keg that had been packed tight for decades. In the aftermath of the riots, the federal government stepped in, determined to address the blatant miscarriage of justice that the Simi Valley verdict represented. The U.S. Department of Justice convened a federal grand jury, and the 4 officers were indicted on charges of violating Rodney King's civil rights. This time, the trial would be held in downtown Los Angeles. This time, The jury was more diverse, composed of 9 whites, 2 blacks, and 1 Latino. The federal prosecution presented a more focused case. They argued that the officers had acted with specific intent to violate King's constitutional rights against unreasonable seizure and his right to be free from an assault by someone acting under the color of law. They utilized an enhanced version of the holiday tape and presented a compelling case that the officer's use of force became unlawful the moment King was effectively subdued on the ground. In April 1993, nearly a year after the riots, the federal jury delivered its verdict. Sergeant Stacy Kuhn and Officer Lawrence Powell were found guilty. They were later sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. Officer Timothy Wind and Officer Theodore Briceño were acquitted for a second time. The split verdict was not the total victory many had hoped for, but it was a measure of accountability, a legal acknowledgement that a crime had, in fact, been committed on that dark roadside 2 years earlier. The city of Los Angeles, holding its breath, remained calm. For Rodney King, the man at the center of the storm, life was never easy. He received a $3.8 million settlement from the city of Los Angeles in a civil lawsuit, but the money did not bring him peace. He became an reluctant symbol, a historical figure trapped by 81 seconds of videotape. He struggled with alcoholism and had numerous subsequent run-ins with the law. Yet, he also displayed moments of remarkable grace. During the riots, he made a memorable, halting public plea, asking the world, "People, I just want to say, can we all get along? Can we get along?" It was a moment of simple, human anguish that cut through the rage and the rhetoric. On June 17, 2012, Rodney King was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool, an accidental drowning. He was 47 years old. So we return to the central question, to the anatomy of this case. How did a verdict so profoundly disconnected from the visual evidence come to be? The answer is that the verdict was not simply a response to a video. It was the end product of a complex and flawed process. Its anatomy was composed, first and foremost, of a change of venue, a legal maneuver that removed the case from its community and placed it before a jury whose life experiences and perceptions of law enforcement were fundamentally different from those of the residents of Los Angeles. Its anatomy was also built on a masterful defense strategy that did not just present facts, but created a new reality. A reality where a man on the ground was a monster, where baton blows were procedural responses, and where 81 seconds of violence could be reinterpreted, frame by frame, into an act of self-defense. The defense successfully exploited the gap between what an image shows and what a person can be persuaded to see. Finally, the anatomy of the verdict was defined by the context into which it was delivered. It was a single judgment dropped into a city already saturated with the fuel of racial injustice, economic despair, and a deep-seated animosity toward a police force that many saw as an occupying army. The verdict was not the cause of the Los Angeles riots. It was merely the match. The fire was the result of a slow, decades-long burn of inequality and anger, waiting for a moment of profound and public injustice to finally burst into flame. The 81 seconds of tape filmed by George Holliday showed the world what happened to Rodney King on a dark roadside in 1991. But the trial, the verdict, and the fires that followed revealed something far more unsettling: the vast, unbridgeable chasm between seeing an event and processing its truth. This has been Anatomy of Crime. where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.